So I'd like to introduce our next presenter in the panel on building the capacity for resilience. Our next presenter is Qiaoyun Zhang. She's co-chair of the Risk and Disaster Topic Interest Group of the Society for Applied Anthropology, production assistant of American Roots, and she's an undergraduate instructor at Tulane University. And she's going to talk about cultural heritage protection after disasters, principles and practices of the post-earthquake reconstruction of the Chinese ethnic Qiang communities. I probably goofed that up, but please welcome Qiaoyun Zhang.
So, good morning, everybody. Okay, great. So, disaster anthropologists have argued that successful post-disaster recovery projects have to take local cultures into consideration. Successful cultural heritage protection after disasters, however, heavily relies on building local capacities. Okay, so to increase, quote, the ability of individuals, organizations, and societies to perform functions, solve problems, and select and achieve objectives in a sustainable manner, end quote. But what happens when local cultural heritage is seriously considered by a state agency in the recovery? How is the capacity to protect cultural heritage built? Who should such efforts target, and what are considered to be desirable outcomes in these interventions? On May 12, 2008, a devastating 7.8 magnitude earthquake shook Wenchuan County of southwestern Sichuan province, China, where 80% of the Chinese ethnic Qiang people live. The Qiang are one of the 55 officially recognized ethnic minorities in China. The Chinese government quickly assembled major human and material resources to aid earthquake relief and reconstruction, significantly oriented toward retaining and reconstruction local cultures. With the aim of developing and modernizing the Qiang, the Chinese state initiated recovery planning based on its own interpretation of the Qiangness. In 3 years' time, most of the group's villages in Sichuan has been completed, rebuilt into modernized heritage tourism destinations to present and sell aspects of the Qiang culture. So today, I will discuss the specific principles and practices taken by the Chinese state to protect Qiang cultural heritage after the Wenchuan earthquake. I argue that although substantial resources towards recovering Qiang cultural heritage was devoted, ultimately, the reconstruction project ends up destroying the very ecological, political, and social context upon which the survival of the cultural heritage depends on, and subsequently marginalizing the capacity of the local community to protect their own culture. Such a failure is largely caused by the inadequate understanding of the mechanism of cultural heritage, as well as the ignorance of the ability of the local Qiang people to preserve and interpret their own heritage. This presentation begins with an overview of the anthropological review of cultural heritage and capacity building, following a brief introduction to the Wenchuan earthquake and its relief. A detailed analysis of the restoration and protection of the Qiang cultural heritage is discussed, concluding with a discussion concerning the problems entailed increasing local resilience and building local capacity. I conclude that effective protection of cultural heritage after major disasters should adopt an integrated conservation approach. It has to, on the one hand, preserve the ecological context and social environment in which the heritage culture develops and flourishes, and on the other hand, enhance the participation, capacity, and creativity of the local people in heritage cultural protection. To protect cultural heritage requires a comprehensive understanding of the mechanism and meaning of cultural heritage and its relation to the ecological, political, and social context in which the culture is shaped. Anthropologists have long argued culture as the different ways in which peoples around the world cope with the environment, construct social organizations and relations, explain origins of the world and meanings of life, as well as develop multiple technologies and material culture. Anthropologists argue that culture should be understood as a dynamic system consisting of material and intangible components. Instead of treating culture as a confined, ahistorical entity, anthropologists now collectively propose that culture should be an open-ended process which changes through time and is constantly influenced and shaped by foreign forces. This has also enhanced the resilience of culture. The internal variation and hierarchical multiplicity of cultures have also been discussed. The Qiang are one of the oldest ethnic groups in China. However, given the small population and meager economy, the Qiang culture has long been ignored and invisible at the edge of vanishing through the time. While the Qiang have developed particular cultural features and traditions, the historical formation of the Qiang is a result of a long-term communication among the Han group, the Tibetan group, and the Qiang groups in the same region. The Han are the ethnic majority of Chinese population. As the socio-political environment varies among different Qiang settlements, cultural variations across different Qiang groups are clearly evident. The most important reason to protect the material and intangible heritage of the culture is to preserve the distinct cultural values and social relations on which the heritage takes shape. Most of the Qiang live in the mountainous regions of Sichuan province. Their livelihood is largely dependent upon animal husbandry and basic agriculture. Lacking an abundance of natural resources, the Qiang rely on a carefully balanced human-environment relationship, as well as a close-knit social organization to sustain lives and support each other. Not only do the Qiang architecture, rituals, crafts, and performing arts develop out of the particular ecological, cosmological, and social context, they can only flourish where the complex cultural ecological system is well protected. According to the UNESCO report on World Heritage Capacity Building Strategy, strategies to safeguard world culture have witnessed a paradigm shift from training individuals to building local capacities. Specifically, capacity building in protecting world heritage consists of three levels: the individual, the institutional, and the relationship among different constituents. Capacity building requires a people-centered approach. All men and women should have the right to share the resources for the protection of their heritage and the power to be authors of their own development. In practice, capacity building cannot take place in isolation. It is embedded in the social, political, and economic environment. Capacity building needs to identify the varied needs and capacities of people of different age, gender, economic, political, and religious status. It should promote sustainable changes and development for people and their culture. This brief introduction serves as a point of contrast to demonstrate the problems on the part of the Chinese state concerning the meaning of the Qiang culture heritage and local capacity in the so-called culturally sensitive reconstruction of the Qiang villages, highlighting the complex interplay of overwhelming state power and the vulnerability and resilience of the affected population. So, with 70,000 fatalities, 70,000 human fatalities, and economic loss of more than $120 billion, the 2008 Wenchuan earthquake is, quote, the most destructive one with the widest affecting scope and most serious disaster-induced losses ever since the founding of the People's Republic China in 1949, end quote. It was particularly catastrophic to the Qiang, claiming about 10% of the total Chinese Qiang population, and ruined most of the Qiang villages in the affected areas. The post-earthquake recovery of the Qiang communities, however, became exemplary of what the Chinese state government termed miraculous reconstruction, referring to the state-directed swift and massive transformation of most of the affected areas. State and private agencies completed more than 40,000 reconstruction projects nationwide in 3 years' time, with an enormous government-led investment of 1 trillion RMB, 155 billion US dollars. An even more fascinating aspect of miraculous reconstruction is its heavy emphasis on the restoration and reconstruction of the local culture. As I have argued elsewhere, the Chinese state plays a determining role in commanding and managing post-Wenchuan earthquake relief and recovery. The Wenchuan earthquake and its relief become an opportunity to demonstrate the Chinese state's compassion and unchallengeable authority towards the wounded members, as well as to strengthen the patriotism, national unity, and the leadership of the Communist Party. The state-led, culturally sensitive reconstruction of the Qiang villages, in turn, reveals the state's assumptions of the status and significance of subaltern cultures in the nation's development scheme. So specific principles and practices of the Qiang cultural heritage protection include, first, infrastructure reconstruction, especially the reconstruction of rural housing. Second, rescuing and recovering natural and cultural heritage items. Third, rebuilding local industry by developing tourism and a cultural industry represented by the Qiang embroidery and other crafts. And fourth, constructing the spiritual homeland of the Qiang. So the first practice I would discuss is the rebuilding of traditional architecture. The first items protected through the program is the traditional architecture skills and embroidery crafts of the Qiang. So as you can see that the traditional Chinese Qiang watchtowers, the quintessential representative of the Qiang architecture skills, are rebuilt and newly reestablished in many reconstructed Qiang villages. One amazing aspect of the Qiang architecture skills is that the family houses and watchtowers, as is shown here, are built without any blueprint, suspension wires, pillars, or framework structures. Qiang people depended on their traditional skills, accumulated experiences, and surrounding natural resources to build such architectures. And Qiang cultural crafts, especially represented here, the embroidery, is also widely promoted after the earthquake. And my close friend Li Xinxiu, the nationally nominated the Intangible Cultural Heritage Inheritor of the Qiang embroidery, was invited by the Smithsonian Institution Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage to participate in the 2014 Folklife Festival, which featured China and Kenya, to showcase this kind of initiative. So the second major aspect protected in this project is the white stone worship, Shibi culture, and other oral traditions of the Qiang culture. So here, the Shibi culture embodies the religious belief and the cosmological viewpoint of the Qiang. Shibi are the Qiang ritual men. They are traditionally responsible for exorcism, leading worship, healing the sick, and officiating weddings and funerals. After the Reconstruction, many Shibi have been invited by national and international agencies to perform at various events and festivals. Such nationwide and international promotion of the Shibi culture has greatly increased the awareness and popularity of this important cultural heritage. So the third aspect, Heavily promoted in this project is the folk festivals and other ritual celebrations of the Qiang people, especially the Qiang New Year celebration, for example, which is also listed as part of the Chinese National Intangible Cultural Heritage, is now widely celebrated. Each year, most of the reconstructed villages receive government funding to hold the New Year festival around, actually next month in November. So it has become the biggest event for the Qiang since the earthquake, as well as for the tourists curious of the Qiang traditional culture. During the festival, Shibi and their apprentices usually travel from different villages to perform in certain villages. All of them are required to wear long blue hemp gowns decorated with feathers, animal bones, and embroideries to look authentic. Their performances, however, are taken out of context. The worshiping ritual only conducted secretly at the sacred mountains is now publicly performed and introduced as a ritual to bring peace and happiness to the visitors. The solemn sheepskin dance only performed during funerals to send the dead souls back to their spiritual homeland is repeatedly organized to showcase the Qiang's traditional culture, traditional dance during the New Year's festivals. So, although the reconstruction projects aimed to restore and maintain Qiang cultural heritage since the earthquake, they have led to many problems that not only endanger the continuation and transmission of the cultural heritage, but also hinder the local people's right and capacity to protect and carry forward their culture. Authoritative outside interference and unchecked tourism development are two of the most severe setbacks of many of the reconstruction projects. So as advocated by UNESCO, capacity building in cultural heritage protection ideally utilizes a people-centered approach. However, the Chinese state-led reconstruction not only fails to enhance the local rebuilding capacity, but also marginalizes the right and power of the local people. In many of the reconstructed villages, the ecology and economy of local lives have been drastically altered, negatively affecting people's ability to sustain their cultural lives and thrive on their own. For example, much of the village's already limited farmland is expropriated to build tourism-related facilities and sceneries. Having lost a stable income from farming, most previously self-sufficient villagers are now vulnerable to fluctuations in the larger economy brought by tourism business. The culturally sensitive project again rendered the villagers victims of the authoritative power of the state, perpetuating the political and economical vulnerability which caused their plight in the first place. While features of the Qiang culture are preserved through projects, the carriers and inheritors of such cultural heritage, the local Qiang people, are often marginalized. In many villages, no villager was was invited to participate in the planning of the reconstruction projects. Moreover, villagers have to support the project unconditionally, including selling their farmland at a lower price for construction of tourist attractions, letting outside construction workers remodel the structures of their own houses, and performing at the government-led events for little payment. For example, the fixing and rebuilding of the watchtowers was led by outside construction companies hired by the local government. The skills and experience of the local people were completely excluded. The watchtowers were built with concrete utilized modern construction machines, completely disregarding most of the Qiang traditional architecture techniques. The reconstruction also failed to provide adequate support for the education and advancement of the Qiang cultural inheritors, such as the training of the Shibi. So, another aspect of this problem with this project is manipulating the cultural heritage for tourism development. So, the reconstruction purposely built the Qiang villages as representatives of the nation's past culture, negatively distanced the Qiang from the fellow Chinese ethnic groups and exoticized them, the Qiang culture, as something distant and historical, confines them in the national past, deprived of any development and diversity. So, and the tourism project considers very little about the sustainable growth of the village. The project fails to increase the resilience of the affected population, giving them very little support to bounce back strongly and sustainably. Many villagers and tourists complain that aid money has been wrongly used to decorate the village into nice-looking tourist sites, while failing to solve the economic, political, and social problems impeding their long-time development. So, I want to conclude that this Chinese state-led culturally sensitive restoration and reconstruction efforts demonstrate that successful cultural heritage protection depends on an appropriate understanding of cultural heritage as a system, as well as the humble recognition of the local groups as authors of their own recovery. Protection cultural heritage after crisis and disasters should help restore and sustain the cultural ecology and social network in which the cultural heritage forms. It should safeguard both the material and intangible cultural heritage and save cultural values and aesthetics attached to the different forms of cultural heritage. An integrated conservation approach should be adopted. It includes static and dynamic protection. Static protection salvages and collects materials, artifacts, and academic records of the cultural heritage. Dynamic protection, on the other hand, preserves the ecological conditions, cultural traditions, and social relations of the affected region. And cultural heritage protection should put local people at the center of the work. The heritage community can only survive where adequate support for and understanding of the cultural system are presented. The needs of the heritage community should be respected and included in the heritage protection programs, where their skills, experience, and values are seriously considered. More importantly, the heritage community needs the power and freedom to express their desires and execute their visions for the future of their culture. They should be allowed to present alternative views about protection and to negotiate their perceptions with outside planning agencies. The ultimate goal of cultural heritage protection, after all, is to provide the necessary means and guidance to enable local people to sustainably preserve their distinctive way of life. Thank you. So, yeah. I want to extend my acknowledgement to the funding agencies that supported my work through the years. So now I would love to invite Andrew Hare from Freer Gallery of Art and Arthur Sackler Gallery and the Smithsonian for his comments.
Thank you, Qiaoyun. That was very insightful look into that complicated situation. I'm going to comment a bit about various aspects of your talk, but there's some introductory comments I'd like to make as well. I'd like to say, first of all, how honored and thankful I am to be included in this conference, because it's interesting to me. It's an important dialogue that you're having. There are very nuanced discussions going on, and I think it's really important to bring people together, and you've created a community here, and you're clearly inviting people into the community. So it's interesting to be part of that, because I've been kind of peripherally aware of you for many, many years, and I've always thought, how interesting, that must relate somehow, and I've realized, wow, what we've been talking about, what I've been doing for years, which is the care of East Asian paintings, so paper-based materials, screens and scrolls, how do I incorporate traditional methods of care which have developed over centuries into their existence in a new context in the West? How do we take care of these objects? And so looking at using traditional methods for doing passive climate control, microclimates, how do we incorporate those traditional methods and ways of doing which have evolved over centuries and centuries of disasters and use into this modern context? And I'm like, wow, we're doing preparedness for disasters. This is great, we're already doing it. And that, understandably, it's important to realize that these other functions going on of caring for collections, of doing surveys, for condition reports, and all this data tabulation, and all these other things we're doing is really part of that bigger picture. It's fortunate that it took me this experience to realize that we're part of that bigger picture. And maybe there are other communities out there that are nearby that don't realize that they're all part of this process. And if we can pull it more together at those other levels, perhaps that gives us more force, more connections, more funding, everything we need to really move the whole process forward as part of an ongoing process rather than a response mechanism, a thought. Anyway, so my experience is with Japan, which is a neighbor to China, and we all know that neighbors, get along sometimes, and they learn from each other, and, China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, they've all been borrowing from each other for about 2,000 plus years. So there's a lot of back and forth that's been going on, and it's interesting to bring it right up to this example because I can see corollaries where what's going on in Japan relates and doesn't relate to what's going on in the situation in China. It's interesting to me that so far I don't think there's been a lot of discussion about the Far East aspect of what's going on, and actually China, Japan are countries that have been dealing with this as everyone else has, but in, I think, rather interesting, thought-out, constructive ways. I mean, Japan first created the sense of cultural properties preservation. The whole idea of taking care of this goes back to the 19th century, when there was a dramatic shift in the government and the society there, and that they adapted this. And I think this also ties into what's going on with the People's Republic, is that they took these ideas, which they borrowed from the West. They came from Europe. So I like what Lori Volley said about R&D redefining that term as rip-off and duplicate, but I would take it back a step. I would say it's rip-off and development, because they're ripping off the idea, they're taking it, which is great. Why reinvent the wheel? Take those ideas, but let's develop them to suit that culture and its cultural needs, right? And I think that there again, it's interesting to see what China has done with that, because clearly they've been dealing with this for a very long period of time, and they have brought in certain economic and political needs to recreate, reform, rethink what's going on there. I can only speak to it from my reference point, having spent 10 years in Japan under the Ministry of Culture. Working in conservation, I was there for the earthquake in '95 and was kind of underwhelmed by the response because they weren't really prepared to deal with cultural preservation, heritage preservation at that time, to the extent that you would have expected because of their long tradition. I mean, going through World War II, that was a huge push to redevelop, to do all the inventories and the classifications and set up the systems and the funding and everything. Really, Japan took off right after World War II to really make that happen right up until the 90s. And then, you have the Fukushima disaster. So you've got earthquakes, you got tidal waves, you got a nuclear meltdown on top of that. I mean, Hollywood couldn't come up with that plot line, right? I mean, it's out of control. And what do? I mean, is Godzilla arriving the cherry on top of that one? It's insane. So, we're gonna have all these extremes, but how do we respond to that? How do we tie that together? So I think it's an interesting lesson to look at other countries who have been dealing with these problems and have their own ideas, and they've obviously borrowed from these other cultures. Let's look at that as well. And all that information is online. All of Japan's laws, which they developed, all the ways that they're dealing, they're really good at publicity as well, and it's all up there. So maybe that's another culture we can look at to see how they've tried to resolve these issues and develop, because I think a lot of the information that we're looking for has been experimented with by other cultures out there, and if we kind of open up to other cultures and how they're looking at it, perhaps there are good and bad lessons that we can pull from them, okay? So, that's the intro. I've got some prepared comments here, and then I think it's important that we can have some discussion, question and answer with this. So, this second panel, I think it's been really interesting for me to hear the three speakers present different perspectives from their personal involvement and research related to recovery principles, planning, and practices in the wake of natural disasters. As three different facets of the disaster recovery matrix, McCarthy, I think, focused on utilizing still evolving new technologies to expedite a complicated process to interrelate a series of steps dependent on gathering, collating, and dispersing critical data for analysis in a limited time frame. Building a systematized network to facilitate identification of cultural heritage also lays the groundwork for the advancement of future recovery projects. I mean, it's wonderful. It's important that that information be out there. Hornbeck walks us through the cultural negotiations and practical aspects necessary to implement the process of recovery, identification, recovery, storage, and treatment of cultural heritage with an ultimate goal of education and some level of self-sufficiency. Intercultural exchange, relationship building, and developing a fluid set of procedures that evolves within the particular cultural context of Haiti leads to developing the procedures and establishing goals for this cultural heritage recovery program. Zhang takes a step away from the immediate process of heritage recovery and is able to look back over the governmental process using the lens of cultural anthropology to assess aspects of success or potential failure in a long and complicated cultural renegotiation, if not redefinition. Comparing these three scenarios, similarities and discrepancies become between the relationships of the stakeholders and the outcomes, desired, defined, and achieved, begin to develop. At the core of this tripartite relationship is the culture in distress, with its human, physical, and intangible cultural qualities thrown into disarray. Aid arrives from another cultural context, typically with a different economic and social background, providing humanitarian concern, specialized knowledge and expertise, and a drive to work hard and problem solve, guiding its efforts. Uniting these two players in the balance of cultural heritage rescue is a larger government agency with its own set of rules, assets, and desired outcomes. With each example that we only know from a brief introduction, I think a complicated series of negotiations and cooperative efforts seems to define the recovery process from start to some point where resources are redistributed and the intense relationship of recovery is normalized, however possible, and the players return to their previous but hopefully more aware roles. It is striking that each case requires its own process. One could not be easily overlaid on another and attain similar success or failure. Are these differences cultural, economic? Are they personal? Can these factors be universalized to build a model that is effective and efficient? And with such differences, is it the immediacy of need and the fear of loss that helps drive the process toward cooperation and collaboration? How can this action under emergency be reconsidered as a longer-term relationship for mutual benefit? As McCarthy makes clear, technology is a huge asset to the complicated process of cultural heritage recovery, enabling improvements in scale and efficiency with exponential effect. Hornbeck develops a thorough plan for the recovery process from initial assessment to creating a treatment and educational model for self-sustainability. These are both great tools that will have applicability in the larger context of this conference and the development of models and methods to improve this humanitarian process on an international scale, but it is Zhang who brings a consciousness to the process. By examining the roles of each stakeholder, she questions each addition and outcome in a greater context of cultural history and continuity. Considering the role of the culture in distress and the larger ring of supporters and benefactors, perhaps it is this level of interaction in the process of cultural heritage recovery that most needs to be considered, understood, and made integral to the planning and implementation process. Of course, there must be a balance of the immediate needs and goals, but shouldn't this also consider the involvement of local resources, as you point out? And perhaps existing educational systems, community organizations, and indigenous know-how to inform and develop process and longer-term outcomes. From my own experience, as I briefly spoke about Japan, I would like to mention the recovery process implemented by the Japanese Agency for Cultural Affairs, which is essentially Japan's Ministry of Culture, which is under the Ministry of Education. And specifically, I want to talk about the Fukushima Disaster, which is known as the Great East Japan Earthquake, and subsequent tidal wave, and then, of course, the nuclear contamination that happened in 2011. Of course, the immediate response was humanitarian aid, but the system that was set up for this essentially was the same for cultural heritage recovery in the months and years following. The agency established an emergency operations center in the region to assess and understand the extent of damage and manage requests for help from the disaster areas, which I'm sure is very much like what was going on in China. Beyond the drastic effects on people's lives and the economic impact on the region was growing concern about the effects of the catastrophe on education and culture. And here this is kind of interesting because I think we start seeing a little separation in the road here. These were seen as important aspects of the social fabric and necessary for bringing hope and a gradual return to normalcy back to the region. The ACA stated soon after the situation had stabilized, it is important to maintain the community identity by valuing the history and culture of the communities and passing on a cultural heritage. And again, I think it's really important to compare the way the different governments react to these situations and the statements they're making about them and what their future should mean. So, in this case, a restoration and reconstruction headquarters was set up and the work with local authorities to provide basic services to the population and help with stabilization, recovery, and cleanup. The protection of cultural properties was regarded as essential for the restoration of affected areas. An arts and cultural consortium for reconstruction was established, and it's interesting how many of these things are similar to what other people have been speaking about over the last day and a half. This was established an aim of facilitating cross-disciplinary cooperation among administrative agencies, conservation organizations, and research centers, artists, art organizations, businesses, foundations, and many other local organizations and individuals in an effort to support the reconstruction of affected areas through art and culture. And I present all this because I think it's important to say that you can have the central government come into a situation like this, and even though there is a very elaborate system, that there are ways to perhaps more insightfully interact with the local culture to bring about the desired results. So the Agency for Cultural Affairs took action through provincial governments and boards of education, very much like China, and created policies to facilitate restoration and reconstruction. In cooperation with relevant local municipalities, the ACA organized a system to mobilize necessary experts and a local workforce to manage the various sites that were damaged. Specialists guided local teams to tabulate data, update the status of ongoing problems, and advise on procedures, next steps, etc. Again, parallel, but unfortunately very different from what was going on in China. So researchers from various education institutions coordinated this program on site. So along with the ongoing care of these cultural properties at the national and provincial level, there was a greater push towards local education. And I think this is an important factor that has been touched upon a few times, but I think it's key for what you've been saying as well, that the standard educational process was in hiatus due to the loss of life in educational facilities, in this case, as in Sichuan, and to instill a sense of purpose and connection to one's cultural heritage and to reestablish a foundation for education, the faculty, students, and volunteers were taught basic concepts and techniques for remedial treatment, care, and housing in order for them to better preserve the thousands of objects that had significance for their own cultures, the local municipalities, village shrines, and temples. So perhaps this model that encourages and enables the place of need to become part of its own resolution is essential for creating a sustainable advance that we are considering today. Okay, thank you. So, questions?
Barry Burgee, formerly with the National Endowment for the Arts, now retired. I wondered, China early on signed on, ratified the UNESCO Convention on Tangible Cultural Heritage and became a party. I wondered whether in response to the earthquake, whether the information, the inventorying and the other information that came about as a result of that was used in response, or whether it was ignored, or whether it was just not known by the government, those who were responding.
Thank you for this very important question, because yes, the earthquake took place where the Intangible Cultural Heritage campaign was actually going on in China after China joined the party. And so there was, like I said in my presentation, several items of the Qiang Intangible Cultural Heritage were listed as a national intangible cultural heritage immediately after the earthquake. And a lot of the resources were devoted to protection of such heritage. But you're right, in the case then, we did not have much inventory knowledge about what the cultural heritage looked like before the earthquake. And I think the experience of the Qiang showcased and how the Chinese government is actually learning to deal with the intangible cultural heritage in China. First, like in my understanding, first to identify each of them and looking for the people, what we call in China like the intangible cultural inheritors of each intangible cultural heritage items, in order to identify them on the provincial and on township level, and to give them financial support and for education purposes. So and the other steps, as I didn't talk in my talk, is there is a movement of building what we call the Qiang cultural preservation area. So we're considering the understanding like the culture as a system, and they're building a area then including that for the Qiang cultural development, so in order to protect the ecological environment there, as well as the lives of people residing inside the area. So those are the plans, and according to during my fieldwork between 2012 and now, like this plan is slowly implemented. And so although the vision is great, there's a very slow movement about how to actually implement those projects in the areas. Sorry.
If I can just continue, we were talking earlier about this and the speed of response and the amount of response in a given time and how important that timing is. So I'm interested, do you feel that what they're doing now with this cultural heritage area is a response that the government has after looking at what they've done initially, or was this part of the original plan, do you think?
I think that's a initial plan, because I talked to, I did research with the people who are leading the Intangible Cultural Heritage campaign under the Chinese Ministry of Culture. And they have the vision of protecting the intangible heritage with a dynamic approach, meaning that protecting the culture in the living form, meaning then having to let people not confine the cultural heritage as something to be displayed, but protecting it as it can have real effects in real lives. But that's their vision. But according to my research in Qiang culture, that it's really hard to actually how to balance or how to make intangible cultural heritage part of people's life there, rather than some staged performances for tourism or like some academic records.
Thanks very much. Qiaoyun, I think that was such a fantastic presentation, and if you're an undergraduate now, I think we expect great things from you in the future. I think that was a stunning performance, very, very impressive. And that's not only because you illustrated perfectly all my points from yesterday morning. Yeah. I think we could not have had a better case study of how you have to relate it to politics, economics, and the wider social context. But I think, Andrew, I'd take you a bit to task on your comments, because I think what it's highlighted is that is the problem of how we deal with governments. I mean, and this came up this morning about Cuba as well, how with the change of government, the whole project became much more difficult. How do you get that support? And I think we have to face up to the fact that sometimes, maybe quite often, the government is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And we have to be very clear about this. And what we've, in your example, Qiaoyun, you've given an excellent example of how it's almost parallel to, many of you remember Naomi Klein's book from 10 years ago, Shock Doctrine, Disaster Capitalism, which used the argument that disasters and calamities were being used and are being used as the opportunity for business corporations to benefit from the contracts that come with that. What the Chinese state seems to be using is the opportunity of the earthquake to impose its idea of what is modernization and development on a cultural ethnic minority. And this is widespread. It isn't only China. And the Japanese example, I mean, the 1995 earthquake focused on Kobe. A very significant number of the deaths there were of a quasi minority group called the Barakumin, who were housed in wooden houses, and the Barakumin are roughly equivalent to untouchables in India, and traditionally worked with bodies of animals and were involved in leather work. And they'd switched to making plastic shoes instead of leather shoes for modern society, and were storing very dangerous flammable chemicals in their wooden houses. Now, in Japan, it's almost impossible to talk openly about the Barakumin because of their status. And I've done this in a couple of conferences, and people freeze me out because I actually even use the word. And I think that what we have here is a problem of how, in different contexts, the politics and economics of state power is quite a significant barrier to the protection of heritage, or we get this kind of fake, exoticized heritage that Qiaoyun has been describing so well. Thank you.
Do you want to respond? Or?
You can go first.
That's well taken, and I didn't mean to brush over that. I think what I said was that Japan was totally unprepared to respond to the quake in '95. And I think that says it. They didn't know how to deal with that situation, the social economic concerns there certainly, which I think is the point. And hopefully there was some improvement, if we can say that, in how they responded to Fukushima. But again, there are all those cultural issues too. And I would say that Japan is not a spotless example of how to do things. I'm just saying it's another example that's worth looking at. And certainly they are always walking that line between preserving culture, economic stability, sustainability, all those issues as well. I mean, Japan in many ways defines itself by its culture. That's how they're presented in the world. So there's a huge investment going on there. And if you look at what they've been doing since the 19th century, it's a very interesting kind of back and forth, figuring out what's the path for them to do. And obviously there are problems and situations along the way that show you where you shouldn't be going. And that's what I'm trying to say is that, when you get that much government involvement, which you really do have in China, Korea, Japan, is that it can go one way or the other. And I think it's important to point out different examples from that part of the world where I think there are a lot of borrowing going on. There's a lot of similar ideas being played out, and we need to look at those as well because I think they can be very useful, very informational, good or bad.
Shall I ask the question? Okay. Hello, my name is Aparna. I thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. What I would like to know more from you as strategies is because you said it's like a frozen way of, looking at culture and looking at it in a straitjacket. For those people who are, and this was also a problem now recently in the Tohoku earthquake in Japan, people have to be relocated. And they have to be given transitional housing because recovery would take a long time. And that you must have also seen that in your studies. You must have encountered that. So how would you then suggest that, how do you connect these people who have moved away or relocated, and how would you connect them with their culture? What would be the strategies that you would come up with as a scholar, what would be your advice to the Chinese government?
Thank you for this important question. Actually, the Chinese government has considered that because there are several Qiang communities moved away from the earthquake zone because they were no longer suitable for human living. So I visited the several villages and relocated in different parts of Sichuan province. And surprisingly, they were all built into Qiang tourism villages, heritage culture tourism places. So they're trying to replicate what were in their original villages in the new locations and trying to remind people of their cultural heritage and also trying to help people continue the kind of lives they used to have in the mountainous regions. So that was the plan, but as I talked about, because the ecological environment has already changed, and a lot of things they used to do, like for example, hunting and collecting wild vegetables and wild herbs, and those things were no longer available in the new settings. So the problem now is that they are heavily dependent on the tourism, tour business to survive and to support their lives. And so I'm really concerned about if people, like the tourists, there might change. So a lot, there are always new places to go to. So what if the tourism fad, it fades off in a few years? And it is fading off because people's attention moved away from the earthquake and reconstruction to the new things. So that's the thing, like their business is really slowing down now, and I think that brings us to the sustainability problem, like ways that tourism develop itself.